Hey everyone, it's the host of All Across America, Marco Vig, jumping in for a few seconds before the show to thank y'all for listening, to let you know that I want to hear from you. Tell me what you like about the show, and send me your suggestions too. Follow us on Instagram at AllXAmerica, or visit the website, allacrossamerica.net, and you can use our contact page there. If you want to support us, we're on Patreon at patreon.com/allacrossamerica. Try to respond personally to everyone who reaches out, so say hello. All right, on with the show. Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. There we go. All right. Well, thank you again, Craig, and thank you for your patience. And we had this great riff going yesterday for folks listening at home. This is our second go around, and we had talked about the Florida Embassy and the Conch Republic, and figured just started off the old-fashioned way. And maybe, Craig, you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into writing about Florida culture.
Sure. I'm actually a native Floridian. So if we get interrupted by a Fish and Wildlife Service agent coming in to tag me, that's why. Because there aren't too many Florida natives. I'm from Pensacola originally. My family first arrived in Florida in 1850, apparently looking for a good deal on waterfront condos. I grew up here and thought that everything was normal, not realizing how weird this place was until I went out of state to college and then came back and went, oh, okay. So I spent 5 years working at my hometown paper in Pensacola, 3 years at the Sarasota Herald Tribune, and then 30 at the St. Petersburg Times, which became the Tampa Bay Times. Okay. And now I write a weekly column for the Florida Phoenix on environmental issues.
Oh, wow, that's great. And how did you, and I remember this was in I believe the first introductory chapter to Oh Florida, you had, you got into how you got into Florida culture, because your regular beat, as you said, it was the environmental space, right?
Yes. Yeah. And you know, that really is sort of a gateway to doing lots of stories on weird stuff going on in Florida, like, you know, pythons battling alligators for supremacy in the Everglades.
Right.
A religious cult that smuggled in gigantic African land snails that are because they thought that drinking their mucus would make you healthy, and actually it actually had the opposite effect. You know, stuff people jumping on the back of manatees and trying to ride them. You know, woohoo! I'm riding a manatee. You know. You know, just stuff like that. And that just happens a lot around here. So I went to what was supposed to be a fairly routine meeting of the State Wildlife Commission, and a guy showed up and said, hi, you're putting me out of business. My business is harvesting sea cucumbers that are sold in Asia as aphrodisiacs. And by the way, I brought you all samples. So,
how were they?
I did not partake, and neither did any of the commissioners. I guess they were worried that it would work while the meeting was going on, and they didn't need that distraction.
Right. Well, I'd rather see cucumbers than snail mucus. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. It's not a taste sensation by any means. I mean, you know, this stuff happens all the time. And we kind of take it for granted, we in Florida, but, you know, seen from the outside, it's like, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't happen anywhere else. No other state has mermaids on the state government payroll. You know, no other state do you find python hunters. I mean, they are state employed contract python hunters. We've got a state park where we've got monkeys living in the running wild in the park. You know, we've got iguanas that pop up in people's toilets on a regular basis.
Oh boy.
When it gets cold, they fall out of the trees.
I know that story well.
Yes.
I know that story well.
Yeah. I mean, it's just this constant parade of wacky stuff that goes on here.
My younger brother, Jonathan, who was on the podcast a few episodes back, he was a reporter for an NBC affiliate in Miami for some time. And one of his more famous stories, he's now with CBS as a national correspondent. One of his more famous stories was in a golf course in Miami during a cold snap. And he captured what he called on video kamikaze iguanas. So the whole story, you have the iguanas that would fall out of the trees, and people would try and take them home, and they'd wake up in their heated car. And
yes, that's actually a sort of a famous one. That there was a guy driving in Key Biscayne. It's a cold day. He sees like 40 iguanas knocked out on the side of the road. He stops because he's thinking neighborhood barbecue. He gathers them all up in his arms like cordwood, puts them in the car, and takes off for home. And it doesn't occur to him, I've got the heater on in the car.
Right.
And the iguanas all wake up and start running around, and the car drives off the road, and he wrecks. And bottom line, they ended up having leftovers for dinner. So
right. I was listening to the first episode of your podcast, and for folks that are interested, Craig, welcome to Florida is the name of your podcast, and listen to the first episode and on creatures. Alligators, of course, was the topic, and Florida is famous for its alligators. And looking up alligator, you get to alligators and you think about the worst, and of course the worst would be alligator deaths. And I looked up on Wikipedia, and they have all the cases that have happened in the United States, and it's almost all Florida. The most recent in the United States was Louisiana. And they said that was the first death since it was a Spanish colony in 1774. So what's about the alligators in Florida that they seem to be a lot more, shall we say, active than Louisiana?
I'm not sure you should blame the alligators. I think you should blame the people for not taking the alligators seriously. People who've lived in Florida for a while know that if any body of water that's bigger than a mud puddle is probably going to have an alligator.
Okay.
So there's this profession, I guess you could call it, of guys who jump into retention ponds to go around and collect golf balls.
Right.
And an awful lot of those guys have wound up tangling with alligators. Gee, what a surprise. So it's like
not worth it.
No. See, it's sort of like the reason why Florida experiences more shark attacks than any place in the world. I mean, even Australia.
Really?
Yes, and that's not necessarily because we have more sharks, it's because we have more people in the water.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So it's the same thing with the alligators, You're walking your little yip dog near the water. Alligators are likely to come out and...
I guess so.
Yeah.
One of my questions, as I said, I was in the state last week, and I was having lunch along the Intercoastal Waterway, and we're trying to figure out, is the Intercoastal Waterway, is that brackish, is that salt water, and can alligators live? I presume they can't live in salt water, but can they live in brackish water?
They prefer fresh water, but they can live in brackish water. I mean, it's same thing with manatees. It's a lot of animals are very adaptable to that kind of stuff. So yeah.
And
but you didn't feed any alligators, right?
No, I've never fed any alligators.
Okay,
I keep my distance, and it's interesting how you put it, how it's the people and not the alligators.
It is. Well, I mean, we had an airboat captain giving tours down the Everglades,
right?
And in order to entertain his customers, he was attracting alligators by feeding them marshmallows, and suddenly he was without a hand one day.
Oh God. Yeah. I used to live in New Orleans, and of course there were plenty of alligator tours, and they were famous for trying to fatten up the alligators with a lot of feeding. And you just attracted, whether that be bears and Yellowstones and of course key deer. I mean, more on the cute and cuddly side than the monstrous side.
So some people just don't take the threat of an alligator seriously like they should. And we've actually had guys who've weaponized the alligators. The famous story is the guy who picked up an alligator and threw it through the drive-through window at a Wendy's in Loxahatchee and was charged with assault with a deadly weapon. The deadly weapon being the alligator. Yes.
I mean, I think the other thing, when you talk about people, in that Louisiana is the exact opposite of Florida, in that I think Florida is number 2 in the country for, as you were saying, transplants. So you're one of the few Florida natives, whereas Louisiana is a state where people has historically left. So I feel like the population in Louisiana knows to stay away from alligators, where in Florida, you got a lot of people from the Midwest and Northeast that,
well, and they're all stunned to discover that there are animals where they live. It's like, hey, there's a bear looking through my window. There's a bear in my hot tub or hanging out in my hammock. How did that get here? Well, guess what? They were there before the house was built. You
Right,
know,
right,
oh, a
right.
panther gobbled up my backyard chickens. Well, guess what? You built in panther habitat. That's what's going to happen.
Right,
You know,
right, yes, yes. You're putting out a snack for the panther. Ho
exactly.
how is the panther population doing these days, and where is it? It has what's its territory like in 2022?
Well, I wrote a book about this. It's called Cattail. It came out in
Right.
2020.
Okay.
Panthers, they're the official state animal, and they nearly went extinct.
Yeah.
In 1995, there were maybe 20 to 30 of them left, and that
Wow.
was
Okay.
it. And they were
Right.
suffering from genetic defects. And
Okay.
now, thanks to a bold, some might say desperate experiment, now there are about 200 of them prowling around
Oh,
in
wow.
what's
Okay.
left of wilderness in Florida. Yeah, it's not a lot, but it's a lot more
Right.
than they used to be.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
they're largely confined to the southwest corner of the state. There's some, some in
Okay.
the Everglades. Most of them are in
Right.
the Big Cypress Preserve
Okay.
area, but there
Right.
have been some that have been spotted north of there. In fact, there was one that actually wandered all the way north to Georgia before a freaked out deer hunter shot it.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Wow. Well, that's great. I mean, how did they I mean, that's ten times the population. I mean, of course,
Yeah.
you're not starting with much,
Oh
but
no, you're
what
making me do math. Yes, that's yes,
so, I mean, that's an amazing success story. I mean, was that some
yes.
captive breeding? How did they make that happen?
Well, I'm in my book. I call it the most amazing comeback in endangered species
It
history
really
because
is.
they tried captive breeding, but
Right.
the kittens that they brought in to do captive breeding, they suffered from the same genetic defects that the
Yeah.
adults did. So that meant
I
that
see. Okay.
they'd basically be repeating the same mistakes. So what
Right.
they ended up doing, and this is giving away the plot of my book, but so you have to promise to go buy one anyway. They brought in 8 cougars from Texas
Okay.
because those are very close cousins of the panther. They brought in
Okay.
eight healthy females. 5 of the 8 successfully bred with male Florida panthers and
Okay.
produced kittens that were free of the genetic defects. And so by refreshing
Wow.
the gene pool like that, they were able
Wow.
to uh, not just produce kittens without genetic defects, but in effect create a baby boom because these were
Right.
healthy
Okay.
kittens and they
Right.
survived into adulthood and bred as well. So that's why they're doing so much better now. The problem being though that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, while all this was going on at the state level, was virtually giving away panther habitat. They're basically saying, yeah, you can
To
build
oil
there.
and gas.
Well, no, to suburban development. I mean,
Really?
yes. Oh, yeah. The Southwest Florida area, specifically in Lee
Right.
County,
Okay.
fastest growing area in the state.
And that's
And
what, Naples?
Fort,
Naples,
Fort
Marco?
Myers, Fort Myers, Naples area, yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and so they were building all over the place that had been panther habitat. So now we've got
Really? Okay.
more panthers than ever before, squeezed into a smaller space than ever before.
Right, right. Well, yeah, I mean, I was just out there in Marco Island in Naples last week and I drove there to Vero Beach.
Hmm.
So I'm going, taking the rural roads up through Lake Okeechobee.
Yeah.
And I mean, it just goes from Naples and 10 minutes later, you're in
Hmm.
fields and, you could just see, okay, 3 years from now, this will not be a field.
Yeah.
And you could see the
Did you
progression.
did you pass Ave Maria?
I did, yes, and that's like a
Like
concept
nine,
college community.
yes, 9 miles outside of Naples, they approved
Right,
building this Catholic centered town
right,
with a university out in the middle of panther habitat, and said,
right,
"Oh, that's
okay.
okay." Is Tom Monahan, the Domino's Pizza guy? This was his brainchild,
Ah, okay,
and they built it out there specifically. He wanted this big Catholic university, and then the
right,
town around it, and it's just who lives there, you know?
right,
You know?
right, yeah, but you could see that 10 years from now, we're both gonna be saying to ourselves, "This guy's a genius," because it's gonna be, like,
Mm.
right downtown somewhere,
Yeah, I don't know. It all depends on sprawl, which is not good.
Right,
I mean,
right.
if it's like that, the traffic backups are going to be horrendous. And
Yeah,
and then where do the Panthers live too?
right,
That's the other side
right.
of that.
Well, speaking of planned communities, Florida, of course, has probably the most and some of the most famous, and I
Mhm.
think the Villages would top the
Oh
list.
yeah.
And I was thinking to myself, can anybody name off the top of their head another retirement community in this country besides one that their relatives might be at? And the only one I could think of is the Villages.
Yeah, I mean,
And
we have one called On Top of the World that is
okay,
somewhat like that, but yeah,
okay,
the Villages is the biggest and fastest growing one in the country, and
okay, yeah,
I've been there several times.
okay,
Really nice people I encountered,
yeah,
so
yeah,
I try to avoid making fun of them, but they have the highest per capita consumption of beer in the country,
right.
and
Good for them.
there have been incidents where how can I put this? A guy who wrote a book, who literally wrote the book on the Villages, is called Leisureville,
Okay,
actually witnessed a couple of guys with their canes feuding, like they're dueling each
uh,
other while a woman
wow.
sits in the nearby golf cart and waits to see who the winner is.
Oh my
You know,
goodness. Well,
and there's a
yeah.
huge black market for Viagra there. So,
Right, right. Well,
but I mean,
I mean,
what would you do
sounds
if
like
you were there?
paradise. Sounds
Yeah,
like paradise.
a buddy of mine, his parents live there. He says it's like a landlocked cruise ship.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's out there. The folks there, they have a lot of time on their hands. They
Right.
do a lot of activities. The
Okay.
golf is free, which is a big
Wow.
attraction for a lot of them.
Okay. Right, right.
Pickleball is huge. I don't know if you ever heard
Okay.
of that, but it's
I
huge.
have, yeah.
Line dancing. There are 80 different book clubs there.
Wow.
80 of
Okay.
them.
Wow.
And the people I've talked to, they said, well, we don't think of ourselves as old. We think of ourselves like we're still back in our 40s. We're still active
Right.
and thriving. And then they pointed at this woman at a nearby table who was 90 years old, and they said, now
Right.
she's
Yeah.
old.
Yes,
She'd been
it's
married,
all
and
relative.
she'd been married 3 times. So
There's always a fourth.
do not go gentle. Yeah.
Right. I mean, to be honest, it sounds like a forever college. It's like
Yeah. Without
I'm
the
gonna go to
studying. Yeah.
yes, I'm gonna go to college without the studying, and I don't need to graduate.
Hmm.
I guess I graduated to the great big sky above.
Exactly. That's it. Exactly. But I
So
mean, the people I talked to, they were like, retired professors,
right,
engineers, former
right,
government employees, like
sure.
I said, nice folks, but it's all about, satisfying the self, and there's not necessarily a lot of charity work going on, I don't think.
I
So,
see. Fair enough. Yeah. Well, yeah, on the cruise ship, I guess not. If it's
well, and just recently, like in the last year or two, there's been this huge uproar. There's a guy who lives there who's got his golf cart. Actually, I guess it's been longer than a year. He's got a golf cart that's decorated with anti-Trump slogans,
okay, right.
and he got into a huge conflict with a woman who was wearing a Biden sucks T-shirt, and
Oh
she
boy.
wound up charging him with stalking, and he had to go to
Oh
trial.
boy.
It,
Right.
and this is the place that calls itself America's friendliest hometown. So,
Right. Right. It's
and
unavoidable,
and
but
then more recently, and then 4 people from the Villages got charged with voter fraud because they voted both in the Villages and in the state that they came from.
oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah,
So double dipping, Wisconsin, Florida.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Two
exactly.
swing states.
So the joke going around is, the governor wanted an election fraud police force that answers to him, and the
Right.
legislature gave it to him, and people are like, well, I hope you base it at the Villages because that's where it's going on.
There you go. There you go. Florida's epicenter of debauchery.
Yes, exactly. Well, I'll swap you a
But
Viagra for a ballot.
there you go. There you go. Yeah, I remember when I used to live in Brooklyn, it was a very young area, and my father-in-law visited me, and we were at the going to Whole Foods or wherever it was, and he looked around and he said, "Gee, there's nobody here under 30." And when I went to Naples and I went out to dinner, I was there for work. I was there by myself. I looked around and I was like, there's nobody here under 60. It's like the place to be,
Yeah,
It's like,
exactly.
these places, it's the spot. So, so I mean, real estate is, I mean, Florida is, all about real estate, and it's had its
Yeah.
busts and booms, and from the you had mentioned a West Virginia real estate investor who kind of had invented the Finger Island
Oh yeah.
waterfront property
Back in the
concept. Maybe you could talk.
1920s, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, he invented this idea in the 1920s of dredging the waterfront so that it looked like little fingers are reaching out into the water, And
Right.
that way you can build a bunch of houses along those fingers, and everybody gets a waterfront lot.
Right.
But of course, the canals are just horrible for the environment. They don't flush. They're
Right.
become
Okay.
sort of, they retain the pollutants that go in
Stagnant.
there. It's
Right.
nasty. And most of these places that were built as finger islands were maybe a foot above sea level. What sea level was in the
Right.
20s? Guess what's going on now?
Right. Right.
So those are the places now where you're starting to see lots of the streets inundated on sunny days. And in fact, there was one
Right.
in the Keys I went and visited last
Okay.
year where the water came up in the streets and was there for 90 days straight.
Oh my goodness.
And I mean,
Wow.
and this was salt water, so you drive your car through it, it starts corroding.
Oh, it's
So
no good.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. So it was just nasty. It was
And
nasty.
what key was this on?
This was oh gosh, I want to say it was near Marathon. It was a place called Stillwater Point.
Okay.
Very expensive houses,
Right.
very,
Right.
hoity-toity, but
Wow.
bring your swim fins if you go
Wow.
visit. So
Now, if I remember correctly, there's some places in South Beach area that, given every blue moon, will with the tides will flood, and it
oh
floods
yeah,
on a
Lo-
predictable basis.
lots of king
Well,
tide flooding there. Yeah, and that's and Key West is starting to see a lot of daytime flooding, sunny day flooding as well.
right, right,
Florida is, we're a peninsula with water on three sides. And
right,
so we're one of the prime places that's experiencing climate change right now. It's not a theory. It's
right,
going on here.
right,
Plus
right.
it's it gets hot during the day and stays warm at night the way it didn't used to do that. So
I
we don't
see.
really
Okay.
cool off. And
Right.
there's supposed to be an increase in toxic algae blooms, which we've certainly
Sure.
seen,
Okay.
and mosquito-borne diseases. That's another
Right.
consequence of climate change, and we're having
Right.
problems with that as well. So,
Right. In
but we
terms of
but
Key
we got a
West.
governor who
Go ahead.
won't say the words. He won't talk about.
Yes.
He won't
Yeah.
say the
Well.
words, and
Yeah.
he'll talk about
Yeah.
resilience. We're going to build these
Right.
things to cope with it, but we're not going to do any. And he actually used this phrase: "We're not going to do any left wing stuff to try and stop it.
I
Like
see.
lessen our
Okay.
reliance on fossil fuels. That's bad."
Right. Right. Well, I wanted to turn to it, and we were just chatting over email. We have a mutual acquaintance in Nat Reed, better
Yes.
known as Nathaniel P. Reed, and of course the Hope Sound National Wildlife Refuge. Can you talk a little bit about Nat Reed, who I guess would be the exact opposite of the popular imagination Florida man? I mean, if there was anybody who was more aristocratic in Florida, I think we'd be hard pressed to find
He
someone.
was he was missing the monocle and spats, but he was very very aristocratic. He was a big fisherman. His mother actually said he came out of the womb with a fly rod in his hand.
Right.
And he grew up in the Jupiter area and
Okay.
just fell in love with Florida's natural bounty when he was young,
Right.
and wound up working for Claude Kirk, who was Florida's first Republican governor since
Okay.
Reconstruction. And Kirk made him his $1 a year man in charge of environmental stuff. And they took on, dredge and fill developments and people
Right.
dumping sewage directly into their bays and stuff like that from the,
Right.
this was common stuff in the 1960s.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Reed was responsible for two really important things. One is he helped stop the building of the world's largest airport in the Big Cypress Swamp,
Okay.
which basically saved what was left of panther habitat at the
Right.
time. That's where
Right.
the few panthers that were left were living. And then he got hired by the Nixon administration as Deputy Secretary of the Interior, and
Right.
he and some like-minded friends co-wrote the Endangered Species Act.
Right.
And
Right.
they would get together at a Chinese restaurant, and over their mugu gai pan and spring rolls, they would jot down ideas on napkins and came up with the
Right.
language, got Congress to pass it, got Nixon to sign it, and it became this this huge law. And the endangered species, the first list included manatees, panthers, key deer, and
Right.
alligators. Alligators
Wow.
used to be an
Wow.
endangered species, and now we've got
Yeah.
so many. We actually have a program for nuisance alligators. When when you report in, there's an
Right.
alligator threatening my my little dog, they send a trapper out. And I love the name of it. The name of the program is the Statewide Nuisance Alligator Program, or SNAP
Snap.
for
I
short.
like,
So anytime someone tells you bureaucrats don't have a sense of humor, you can tell them about
right.
the SNAP program.
There you go. There you go. And if I'm correct, the what is now the Nathaniel P. Reed Hope Sound National Wildlife Refuge, there's got to be a better acronym in there. Speaking
Yeah.
of, that was his family's property, was it not? That he had donated to the
Yeah,
state?
I think so. Yeah. I mean,
Which is just
he worked really after the Endangered Species Act. He went on to a very long career of being an advocate for the environment, and he founded
right.
a group called 1,000 Friends of Florida, which fought
Right.
really hard for controls on growth in Florida. And he was a
Right.
big Everglades advocate as well. He
Right.
really
Right.
cared a lot about the Everglades,
Yeah.
and died fishing for salmon in Canada.
Right.
He had always said, "I wish I could catch one last big fish before I pass on." And he caught, I think it was a 14-pounder he reeled in, and then he's going to try and fish for another one and slipped on some gravel and suffered a head injury. But I mean, he kind of got his wish.
He went out the way a lot of people would.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. Great man, and that's my favorite beach in the state. And real estate value has got to be untold. I mean, $1 billion, whatever it is. It's just this untouched stretch of probably 5 or 6 miles in the middle of the Atlantic coast. It's incredible. What are some of your other favorite beaches in the state?
Topsail Hill up in the Panhandle is great, and called that because the dunes are so big that from offshore it looks like sails. It looked like sails on a ship. And there are freshwater lakes just behind the dune line. I think that's the only one of only 2 places in the world where that phenomenon occurs. Sanibel Island is great. Sanibel is wonderful, a famous place for people who want to go pick up seashells. And in fact, the locals talk about seeing the tourists doing the Sanibel stoop, where they bend over to pick up the seashells. And it's actually attracted famous seashell collectors like Thomas Edison, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Raymond Burr, big fan of seashells, and even donated his entire collection to the Seashell Museum that's there in San Diego.
Oh, wow. There's a seashell museum.
The Bailey Matthews National Seashell Museum is located there.
Very cool. Wow.
And they did a poll of their visitors and asked people what they thought seashells were, and a lot of people thought they were rocks, which is just, it's like, no, these are things made by living creatures.
I mean, some of these shells are so big and magnificent. It's hard to imagine that there's something crawling around in there.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and I have to put in a plug here for one of my favorite things about Florida, which is a lot of the best beaches in Florida are state parks. And Florida has the only state park system in the country that's won national awards 4 times.
Okay. All right.
It's just so superior. And the most popular state park is Honeymoon Island State Park in Dunedin, which has gorgeous beaches and is really pristine, partly because they don't allow any camping. You can't stay overnight. You can't bring your RV out there. You basically you go out there for the day and you enjoy the heck out of it. And then you go home. And at one point, when Rick Scott was governor, there was a proposal to let there be a lot more camping, including RV camping at a Honeymoon, and to do lots of other stuff with the state parks, like allow hunting in there and timber harvest and that kind of stuff. And people turned out to the Honeymoon Island State Park public hearing on this. There were 1,000 people who came out for this thing. Wow. And I'd say 999 of them were against doing anything to change Honeymoon Island. They were like, this is our state park. Don't you touch it.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, that's popular, the oversand and much of the rest of Florida. So I'd imagine it wouldn't add much to the equation to have, an untouched stretch. So, that's a good thing.
And the funniest thing was there was a proposal to actually add golf courses to several of the state parks. The thinking being among legislators,
there's not enough already.
There weren't. Florida already had more golf course holes than any other place in the country, and they said we need more golf courses and less state parkland devoted to forests and swamps and stuff like that. And it was they were, and the idea it was going to be Jack Nicklaus designed golf courses.
Of course, yes.
And
Yeah.
even Arnold Palmer said that's a stupid idea, and they withdrew the proposal after a week of being
Oh,
relentlessly
wow.
mocked.
Okay. Well, yeah. Could, one area of Florida that I've never been is kind of the I don't know, the elbow around the Gulf Coast. The
Oh,
area west of, let's say, Gainesville, and I
yeah.
love looking on maps of places that are just so out of the way, and
hmm
it
They
seems to
actually
be
called that the Forgotten Coast.
the Forgotten Coast. All
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
I like that.
In fact, it's so sparsely populated. The Air Force at one point considered making that a missile range, and people
Oh,
and the
really?
people who were living there were like, "Oh, no, don't do that."
Yeah,
But yeah,
yeah,
there's the big, they call it the Big Bend, right where the bend is, and then just
sure.
north of there is the Forgotten Coast over to about, or like around Apalachicola or something like that. And
Okay,
it's a lovely place, especially Cedar Key
yeah.
is really nice.
Okay, yes.
There's the Lower Swanee National Wildlife Refuge near there, so a lot of that
Okay,
is kept very pristine. And
yeah.
two things about Cedar Key. One is that was where John Muir ended up. He made this 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf. This pioneering
Right,
biologist who later, I think, founded the Sierra Club.
he
And
did.
he had this revelation. He got there and a mosquito bit him, and he
Okay,
contracted fever. And so
right.
he had intended to go on to Cuba, but instead he wound up spending 2 months there recuperating.
Okay.
And it occurred to him, maybe not everything in the wild is made for human use. Maybe there are things that
Wow.
exist on their own, like
Right.
mosquitoes, and we should
Okay.
let them do that. And that sort of
Right.
became the foundation of the whole environmental movement.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, isn't that cool? All because of a mosquito. And then the other thing about Cedar Key is, and I just kind of stumbled on this. I was there
Yeah.
visiting in 1890. The mayor of Cedar Key turned it into an island dictatorship.
Okay.
He hired a thug as his town marshal, and the two of them would walk around with shotguns, and they would order people to do silly things just for their own amusement, like, "Hey, you two guys headbutt each other, ha ha ha!"
Right.
And
Right.
nobody dared to take them on because they were
Okay.
so mean. And
Right.
so finally, this one woman wrote a letter. Well, unfortunately, we don't know her name; it's lost to history. But she wrote a letter to
Yeah.
President Benjamin Harrison and said,
Okay.
"You've got to help us. We're under a reign of terror here.
Wow.
You've got to do something." And the New York Times actually sent a reporter down and wrote these reign of terror stories with the headlines and everything.
Right.
And about that time, the mayor and his thuggish marshal beat up the keeper of the customs house, who
Okay.
was a federal employee. And so yeah,
Oh.
exactly. So President Harrison said, "That's it. You crossed the line," and sent a Navy cutter to Cedar Key to arrest the mayor.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Wow.
Cedar Key is the only American city that's undergone a military coup.
That's
And
amazing.
why they don't have an annual celebration of this, the Reign of Terror Festival, I don't
Right.
know. I think it would be huge.
I think so too. I presume that there aren't that many people living there in order to
Not a
sustain
lot.
a fest.
No, it's the vibe there is like Key West before the cruise ship showed up.
Right.
It's very
Right.
laid back, and
Which sounds like paradise to
yeah,
me.
yeah, exactly. Really good
But yeah,
seafood.
everybody knows you don't mess on federal property. You
Mhm.
walk into a post office and you got the signs. You mess with a postal employee, it's
Well,
automatic 7 years.
you say that, but Florida has had more people arrested in connection with the January 6th insurrection than any other state.
Really? Okay.
Yes, yes. A lot of Florida men. A
Really
lot of them. And several in the real estate business, which I find very funny. It's
interesting. Interesting.
like location, location, location. Yeah, but not that one. Don't go to don't go in there.
So, so speaking of the Florida man, could you describe, in the popular imagination, and the first I had heard of the term Florida man was in the News of the Weird, which, if you remember, it
Chuck
was a
Shepard.
syndicated. Yes, Chuck
Yes,
Shepard,
who
and
lived in
he re-
Florida.
did he really?
Yes,
Fair
I
enough.
met
There
him.
you go.
I met him covering a
All right.
trial. Yes.
Wow. Okay. And so he was one of the popularizers, at least for me. And so, yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I'll give you a little bit of history of it. The idea of the Florida man, if you're not familiar, if you've been in a coma or something, is this person who generally is involved in something illegal, thinks he's smarter than he is, often drugs or alcohol is involved, and an alligator or and nudity,
Right.
and the guy who threw the alligator through the drive-through window is sort of the epitome of that, I
Right.
think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, um, and the I've been having fun kind of tracing the idea of the Florida Man back. I mean,
Right.
it
The
really sort of became
entomology.
it became popular, with the internet, where
Sure.
you
Yeah.
could pick up Florida Man stories from all over the country,
Right.
and
Right.
they actually started having people whose job is to aggregate them at British newspapers and
Sh-
Newsweek and places
Sure.
like that. But
Yeah.
in 2013, a guy started doing a Twitter account called Florida Man,
Okay.
the world's worst superhero, and a lot of people
Right.
followed that. And also, there was a Reddit subreddit group called Florida Man
Okay.
with the same
Okay.
motto,
Sure.
also aggregating those stories. But to find the first ones, you actually have to go back to I think 1895.
Wow.
Frederick Remington, the famous Western artist who drew cowboys and Indians, came to Florida to see Florida's cowboys, because
Okay.
Florida remained an open range state until 1949. So it was still more like the Wild West than the Wild West
So,
was at that point.
so when you say open range, cattle can go about their
Yes,
business, no fences.
no
Okay.
fences, and they would wander onto the highways and so forth.
Right.
And so Florida cowboys, or cow hunters as they're known then, there was a big range war going on, and he landed right in the middle of it, and wrote about what he called low-browed cowfolk who would shoot and stab each other over the possession of cattle not fit for a pointer dog to mess on, is the way he wrote about it.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Harsh.
He admired their sort of wild demeanor, but he
Right.
also he didn't like the fact that they didn't face each other in the main street the way they did out west. They ambushed each other in the swamps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So and then and then they show up in literature in Elmore Leonard's books.
Okay.
There's a whole family of them that pop up in his books that are set in Florida. The Crow family, Crowe.
Okay.
Where they're one gets arrested by Marshal Raylan Givens in Miami, and one of them they pop up all over the place, and they're not as smart as they think they are. One of them is introduced in one of the books where he's explaining to his probation officer that he should not have been charged with murder because he shot the wrong guy.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So I mean, it's been a while, and the whole idea of Florida weirdness didn't really grab the nationwide attention until the 2000 election.
Okay. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, in 2000, you had for 3 weeks, nobody knew who the president was, because
Right.
Florida couldn't get its act together. We had butterfly
Hanging
ballots.
chads.
Yes,
Yeah.
hanging chad. We had the Brooks Brothers riot. Remember that?
No, I don't.
Where a
that?
bunch of GOP operatives pretending to be average Joes showed up at an election office, started beating on the window glass, and then they were all wearing Brooks Brothers outfits, so it became known as the Brooks Brothers riot.
Right.
So Katherine Harris was the Secretary of State, which meant she was in charge of running the election smoothly. She didn't understand that the job of Secretary of State in Florida is different from the job of U.S. Secretary of State. She thought she was supposed to be traveling the world and making deals, and not that she had these duties here in Florida. So she had no idea what the election laws said. And she would give these press conferences that were utterly incomprehensible. She actually told one reporter, "I wouldn't know what was going on if it wasn't for reading your stories."
On TV. Right,
yes.
Right.
Yeah. So she that was the first time people looked at Florida and said, there's something going on there that's not right. The people there are just not right.
Right.
And they were correct. So, and then in 2001, do you know Fark.com, that website Fark that aggregates lots of wacky stories?
Okay.
And they tag them, with different tags. They gave Florida its own tag, and Florida is still the only state with its own tag on Fark.com.
Well, that gets us back to how we started yesterday. Was Florida is the only state, as I had mentioned to you, I met some of the members of the board at the hotel I was staying at Fort Lauderdale, who were board members of Florida House. And Florida is the only state in the union with a embassy in Washington,
That's
D.C.
right. The only one that has one, and the only one that needs one. But no, it's a nice thing. I've been there. It was
Yeah.
started by Governor Lawton Childs' wife, Rhea Childs,
Okay.
and the idea was Floridians visit the capital, they need a place of refuge. It's hot in the summer. It's you're out there looking at the monuments and stuff. You get sweaty.
Right.
You need some
Right.
refreshment. Let's stop at Florida House and get some orange juice
Okay.
and sit in the cool for a bit. And that's what they
Right.
do. But they do lots of other things too. They actually have a book club,
Okay.
and they're featuring my book Cattail as the May selection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Excellent.
which is nice. There's 10 bookstores that have lined up to help promote it, and I'm
Great.
doing a Zoom book talk.
Excellent.
So yeah, so it's pretty cool. I am disappointed though when I saw Florida House. I thought the Florida House ought to look like some rundown beach shack in the middle of Washington. It does not. It's like a very elegant 1909
okay.
structure.
Right. And that gets into, of course, the other breakaway nation, the Conch Republic,
Yes.
and I had mentioned it yesterday, and you said, "Oh, everybody knows the story of the Conch Republic." I think within the state of Florida, but I think a lot of folks outside of the state, don't know it, and it happened quite some time ago. So.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too is when I say everybody knows, I'm wrong. I'm wrong about that because 900 new people move to Florida every day.
Right.
And most of them have no idea what they've gotten into, and they don't know the history. They don't know the area. And so that's why we have to keep telling these stories. 1983, the middle of the whole, cocaine cowboys, war on drugs era.
Right.
Key West is such a hotbed of it that the FBI officially classified the Key West Police Department as a continuing criminal enterprise. Because drug dealers were actually dropping off Burger King bags full of cocaine at the police department headquarters.
Wow.
So the U.S. Justice Department set up a roadblock on the I think it was on the 7 Mile Bridge at the entrance to the 7 Mile Bridge before you get to Key West. And they were stopping every car to search it for drugs. And it caused this huge traffic backup. People could not get through to Key West. Right. City of Key West protested. The mayor filed a lawsuit. Nothing worked. And so finally the mayor said, that's it. We're declaring war on the United States. We're seceding. We're calling ourselves the Conch Republic. They actually ran up a flag that had a picture of a conch shell on it. They sent out, I think it was a shrimp boat that attacked a Coast Guard cutter with water cannons. And I think they may have even thrown some pies at him. Not key lime though. And then immediately surrendered and applied for foreign aid.
Right, $1 billion in foreign aid, if I'm right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was just a brilliant move, and so people still celebrate that day, and they sell the T-shirts and stuff like that. So,
wow, something else.
And the blockade ended, so it worked.
It worked. It was in the New York Times. I mean, it was a really crafty. I mean, a big city PR firm couldn't have come up with something any better.
Don't mess with the conchs, man.
That's right. So tell us about the different regions of Florida. I mean, we've got the Keys and we've got Miami, you've got the Southwest, you've got Central, you've got the Panhandle.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. I'm from the Panhandle. I figure, so I know that pretty well. Pensacola is sort of a classic port city beach town, Navy base. So it's got all of that sort of, socially liberal, laid back vibe. But also there's an overlay of the Bible Belt because it's so close to Alabama.
Sure.
And there's lots of crazy stuff that goes on there. For instance, there's a place there called the Floribama Lounge that's right at the border of Florida and Alabama. And every year they didn't do it the last couple of years, but this year they started it back again, the Interstate Mullet Toss, where people stand on either side of the state line and they see which ones can throw a dead mullet further. and have a big party, and meanwhile raise a lot of money for charity, which is nice. Tallahassee is our state capital. It was not the original capital. Originally there were two separate colonies in Florida, the East Florida and West Florida, and St. Augustine was one capital, Pensacola was the other. And whenever we were going to become a state, they said we need to have a a capital that's equally inconvenient for everybody. So,
Right.
they basically found the midpoint, and it was Tallahassee. And
Okay.
who was it? It was Ralph Waldo Emerson, I think, that showed up there in the 1830s and said the town was full of rogues and land speculators. And so, not a lot's changed.
Not a lot's changed.
And they in the 70s, the old state capitol was outmoded and out of room, and there was a move to change the state capital to Orlando, which would be closer to the center of where people lived.
Sure.
They had stopped being confined to St. Augustine and Pensacola. They started moving into the peninsula, and instead, the legislators voted that down and voted to build this big new capital. And they brought in a very fancy architect, Edward Durrell Stone, who gave them a very modern design, and they rejected it. And they said, we don't like this. And so he presented them with a more traditional design, and they didn't quite catch the gist of it and approved it. And so we've now got this 22-story tower sticking straight up with 2 domes on either side of it.
I see.
And it's been voted the most phallic public building in the world. I hasten to add that
can't miss it.
Yeah, there were no women on the design committee.
Right.
Yeah. So that's where our legislators work, and I think that helps to color the character of what they do every day when they're there.
Right.
And it's also a college town. The other big college town being Gainesville, where you have University of Florida football team plays in what's called the Swamp. And the big fight song is the Tom Petty song, I Won't Back Down, because although Petty didn't go to the University of Florida, he didn't go to college at all, but he was from Gainesville. So, and in fact, worked on the grounds crew and allegedly planted a tree there. So people go and pay homage at the tree that Tom Petty.
Wow. Okay.
Yes.
Wow. All right.
Jacksonville is a very industrial city up in the northeast end of the northeast corner of the state. Another port city, another Navy port. And it used to have a big paper plant there, which put out this nauseating smell regularly. And the joke was, that's the smell of money, because it was making lots of money. St. John's River flows through there. It's the biggest river in the state. Flows north and flows very slowly because, of course, it's tidally influenced. Let's see. So going down the coast, you've got Daytona Beach, where there's lots of racing. And in fact, in 1947, that's where NASCAR was founded by guys who love to turn left and then turn left again and then turn left again. A guy named Bill France Jr. got his friends together, and they hammered out the rules for it. And it's unlike any other major league sport, it's a family business. The France family owns NASCAR still.
Wow. Okay.
And then, and originally they raced on the beach. Originally it was a rich man's sport, because the guy who built all the hotels and railroads along the East Coast, he was the one who started that, racing on the dunes. But then it became more of a blue collar sport when France and company took over. Then you get down to the that sort of triumvirate of big cities, where with very ritzy Palm Beach, you've got Fort Lauderdale, and then you got Miami. And Miami sometimes is known as the capital of the third world. It used to be a very sleepy southern town, and then the Cubans showed up and completely changed the city, changed its culture, and not just in the obvious ways of language and food, but even subtle things like a lot of the Cuban men who came there were big fans of boxing, and so they really energized attention in the sport in the 60s and 70s, and that's why Angelo Dundee opened his boxing gym there, and it attracted Cassius Clay, as he was known then, and he fought for Angelo Dundee at the Fifth Street Gym, and that's where he had the big boxing match with Sonny Liston, and then proclaimed himself, "I'm the greatest. I am the greatest." Yeah, I mean, so that was the Cuban influence.
Wow.
That he wound up there. The Keys we talked about. People call it Key Weird. It's really hard to get to, but once you're there, there's, it's a great place to relax, except when the cruise ships pull in, and there's a huge fight going on over that right now. In fact, the people there voted for 3 referendum items to basically clamp down on the cruise ship traffic
Really?
because
Okay.
of the environmental damage it was doing.
Wow. Okay.
And the legislature said you can't do that, and basically overturned the election results, and the
Really?
governor signed that into law and
That's
said,
disappointing.
"Yeah, well,
The
that's the way
will of the
things stand."
people,
Exactly, exactly.
it's
And then if you work your way back up the coast, then you've got sort of the really ritzy Naples. You've got
right.
Fort Myers, which I mentioned, the very fast growing. Sarasota, very, very rich area.
Okay.
The old joke is old people live in Naples and their parents live in Sarasota, or vice, or
Right.
you tell it the other way if you live in Sarasota, versus
Right.
Naples.
Right. Right.
And I mean, Sarasota's got an opera company. It's got lots of art going on.
Okay.
And it used to be a circus town. John Ringling brought his circus there in the winter, and he built this sort of hodgepodge mansion that he designed called Kadazan,
Right.
The House of John. And it's, that's now owned by the state. It's a museum. You can go visit and see his art collection and things like that. And there's lots of cool stuff going on there. Marine Lab, which is a big marine science lab that has lots of public displays. Their founder, Eugenie Clark, who's known as the Shark Lady, the post office just put out a stamp honoring her on her 100th birthday.
Oh wow! Okay,
yeah, just this week. So, and then St. Petersburg, which I call them the Twin Cities, St. Petersburg and Tampa. They're across the bay from each other. And Tampa used to look down its nose at St. Petersburg. The Tampa Tribune once described it as looking like a particularly pinched Albanian village.
Okay.
Because it was known as God's waiting room. A lot of retirees from the Midwest wound up in St. Pete, sitting on the green benches downtown.
Sure.
And now, thanks to craft beer, craft beer has taken over St. Petersburg, and it is this huge, thriving community where I think the average age now is down around 45.
Wow.
And there are 100 craft beer places, and you can take a tour.
Oh wow!
Of all of them. And Tampa wishes it was as vital as St. Petersburg was.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of Tampa is interesting. It has an enclave called Ybor City that was the home of Cuban cigar factories, and a lot of Italians lived there as well.
Okay.
And so that became the place where they first made the Cuban sandwich, which has Cuban elements in it, but also a slice of salami to honor the Italian heritage. Yes, exactly. People in Miami dispute that and say you shouldn't have salami on your Cuban sandwich, and people in Tampa say no, you're right. It's a huge. If you want to if you want to start a flame war on the internet, bring up the Cuban sandwich and where it belongs.
All right.
And I think that's it. Did I cover everything? Yeah.
Pretty much. It brings us back up to the Lost Coast. Although we are, of course, forgetting Orlando and Disney World.
Well, do you really need to know about that?
No. I think everybody knows.
Okay, let me tell you briefly. Orlando was a very sleepy, quiet Central Florida town. It was basically in the area where a lot of the cattle were. Right. And then on November 22nd, 1963, Walt Disney flew over the area in a plane that he had borrowed from, what was his name? The guy who had the old variety show, Duncan. Gosh, I've forgotten his name. Anyway, he flew over the place and looked down and saw that I-4 and the Florida Turnpike were going to cross there. And that a lot of that area was swampy and nothing had been built there. So that meant it could be gotten cheaply. And he said, that's where I want to build my next theme park.
Wow.
He had one on the West Coast, of course, in California, but it was hemmed in by the development around it. He was looking for a lot of land so he could buy it up, build his theme park in the middle, and have a big buffer around it.
Right.
And so he said, that's where I'm going to build. And then they landed and saw people weeping and said, what's wrong? What do we miss? And found out about Kennedy's assassination.
Oh, my God.
So that day was a turning point for America in more ways than one.
Wow.
And the legislators were so eager to accommodate Disney that they basically gave him whatever he wanted, whatever his company wanted, which included their own government power to tax themselves, to set up their own codes, building codes, their own fire department. They can even build their own nuclear plant and airport if they want to.
Wow. Okay.
But when they first started buying up the land, Disney didn't want people to know who it was buying it, or else they jack up the price. So
Right.
he contacted his attorney in New York, a guy named Bill Donovan, who had headed up
Okay.
the predecessor to the CIA, the Office of Strategic
Okay.
Services in World War II. And Donovan said, I got just the guy for you, and referred him to an attorney in Miami who had worked with the secret agents. He had worked with the mafia. He had worked with
Okay.
drug dealers. And he said, oh, yeah, I know how to keep a secret. And so he set up a bunch of shell companies to
Right.
buy the land. And if you walk down Main Street, USA in Walt Disney World now, you'll see the names of those companies on the businesses in Main Street,
Oh,
USA.
wow. Okay. The shell companies.
Yeah.
So I mean, Orlando, when I had first visited, and my wife's uncle Chris, hi Chris, lives in downtown Orlando.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit, it is a central city. It's a great
Yeah.
walkable city.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Great history museum, by the way.
Yeah.
The only history museum I know of that has a statue of a gator wrestler in front of it.
So, I mean, are Orlando's fortunes that closely tied to Disney World? There was a kind of rising tide lifts all ships.
Yes, in a word, yes. There's actually a great book about the origins of Disney World called "Married to the Mouse," which is the description of what Orlando is. Orlando is tied to Disney. If Disney ever tanks, Orlando will tank. So
wow.
I mean, they've diversified. They've got their own Major League Basketball team now. They've got the University of Central Florida. They've got an awful lot of other stuff there now that wasn't there before. But if Disney goes away, I mean, that's it. But the downside of that is people who work for Disney, they don't make a lot of money.
Okay.
And so, Disney World, Disney built its own town there called Celebration.
Celebration, yes. And no pink flamingos allowed, I hear.
Well, and it's all this sort of Key West style architecture with tin roofs and, clapboard houses. And Celebration High School has the largest number of homeless students in America.
Wow.
Because a lot of the people who are working at Disney or at the other theme parks or in the t-shirt shops and gas stations and so forth around it, they don't make much money. They're barely making minimum wage and not over it. And so, they live in the little rundown motels along the street, or they're camping out in the woods. There's a great book about this. It's called Sunbelt Blues by Andrew Ross. I recommend it to everybody. It's riveting. And he actually went out and talked to everybody. He found people in the woods and talked to them. And anyway. So that's sort of the dark side of Disney. It's the happiest place on earth when you're in there, but if you're working there, maybe not so much. So
Sure. Maybe we could talk about some of the native inhabitants of Florida and the Seminole tribe. And you had mentioned one of your favorite Florida men, which was Chief Jim Billy.
Oh yeah,
he had
he's in my Panther book too. Chief Billy. He was born on a monkey farm. He grew up wrestling, putting on displays where he wrestled alligators at a roadside attraction. He served 3 tours of duty in Vietnam. He produced some country music records. He's a licensed cosmetologist. And he was the chief executive of the tribe when they opened their first bingo hall, which the Seminole tribe was the first Native American tribe to open their own casinos. And they and they opened the door for all the other tribes in America to do that.
Wow.
And it's ironic because in the 1920s there was a report to Congress about the Seminole tribe that said gambling is not known among them. And in fact, the Seminoles themselves don't really gamble, and they don't work at the casinos. They hire a company to run the casino. Most of the Seminoles work for other businesses owned by the tribe. Like they actually own a lot of cattle, and they run cattle ranches. A lot of them work there. But because of the money they make from the casinos now, they actually have a pretty high standard of living, which is, they sure didn't used to. They used to be, charity cases, a lot of them. And so it's interesting to see the turnaround. In fact, they've made so much money now. They're so wealthy now. They actually bought the Hard Rock chain, the Hard Rock restaurant and casino
really
chain. Yes. And it was a major deal when they did this. And so it's sort of like well, now they own the white man's totems of, guitars and stuff like that.
Right.
But I mean, and it's interesting. I did a story about that for the Washington Post because they had cut a deal with Governor DeSantis to begin doing sports betting in Florida.
Okay.
That they were going to run the sports book, and the deal was that they argued that they could do that because that you could make bets on your phone during the Tampa Bay Buccaneers game,
right.
but the servers for the computers were on Seminole property, so that made it legal. And the Interior Department signed off on it, but then a judge said no. So the whole thing kind of is in limbo right now. So we'll see how that turns out. But I mean, their standard of living has changed very dramatically as a result. They won't talk about how much money each member of the tribe is paid, but they are paid enough. And it's enough that sometimes when members of the Seminole tribe go out to buy big ticket items like a car or something like that, they will pretend not to be Seminoles because they know the price will get jacked up.
Wow. Well, I mean, I guess that's a good problem to have.
Well, yeah. I do not have that problem.
See, that's a bummer,
And there's another tribe too, the Miccosukee tribe. They are not as wealthy or as big as the Seminoles, but they're the only, I think so. I think this is still the case. They are the only Native American tribe that lives in a national park. They live in Everglades National Park. That's where their reservation is. And and they had a big conflict in the 90s with the Everglades National Park management, and they appealed to their congressman, and he arranged for them to get more of the land from the park. So they are the only Native American tribe that has actually seized land from the U.S. government instead of the other way around.
Right. Wow, that's unprecedented.
They could have, because of the casino, that one casino they run, they could afford to hire very top-notch attorneys, and they actually became very big participants in the push for Everglades restoration, suing the state of Florida for not controlling pollution. So
that's great. And speaking of pollution, and brings me to the manatee. And can you talk a little bit about the Florida manatee and how it's doing?
Yeah, I did a book on manatees called Manatee Insanity. It's actually coming out in paperback in July. Florida manatees have been protected under state law since 1893. Then, of course, under the federal law, the Endangered Species Act, since 73. They are sort of an icon of Florida. They're Florida's most famous endangered species. They were sort of a mystery until a guy named Woody Hartman, who was a Cornell University grad student, came to Florida, came to the Crystal River area, and began studying. Started doing this in-depth study, literally, of manatees, where he swam with them, and took underwater photos and sketches, and studied their lifestyle and stuff like that. The first time he dove in with them, I love telling the story. The first time he ever dove in with them, though, it was in the middle of a mating herd.
Oh boy!
Which these things are as big as Volkswagens. You really do not want to be in the middle of that. Yeah. So he immediately jumped right back out of the water and then tried to figure out how he could do this study without getting back in the water with them. Use a glass bottom bucket or something. Finally said, no, I just got to bite the bullet. But it's good that he did. He then wrote about it for National Geographic. Jacques Cousteau saw the story, was intrigued, came to Crystal River and did one of his big Jacques Cousteau specials called Forgotten Mermaids. The manatees, showed a boat running over a manatee, which of course was horrible.
Boy. Yeah.
Woody Hartman was in the show. And that led to the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
Wow.
Which preceded the Endangered Species Act. And Crystal River is the only place where you can still swim with the manatees because it got grandfathered in before the Endangered Species Act. So they're protected by the Endangered Species Act and Marine Mammal Protection Act, state law, but there are still lots of boats that run them over. It usually kills about a quarter of the number that are killed each year. There's lots of waterfront development that takes away their habitat. And so in 2000, this group called the Save the Manatee Club that was co-founded by Jimmy Buffett and then Governor Bob Graham.
Okay.
Excuse me. They sued. They led a coalition of environmental groups and sued both the state and the feds. Both of them settled in 2001 and agreed to all of their terms, which required setting up more manatee refuges, putting in slow speed zones for boats and things like that. And so, and meanwhile, there's this big backlash among boaters and waterfront developers who started lobbying to take them off the endangered list. They said, look how many more manatees there are now. Because there was now a sort of a manatee population boom because they'd gotten a lot of the new protections. So after 2000, you started seeing thousands more manatees. Well, so they had this big fight. And finally, in 2017, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced, big victory. They're no longer endangered. We're going to call them threatened now. Okay. And then in 2020, they started dying. Oh. And we had a record 1,000 that died in 2021. And they've already had more than 500 die this year. And mostly it's because of an area over near Cape Canaveral called the Indian River Lagoon, which used to be the most diverse estuary in the country. But they've had because of the pollution that has been flowing unchecked into the lagoon. It stimulated the growth of toxic algae blooms that shaded out the seagrass, and the seagrass died. So the manatees have nothing to eat. When they go there, they need a refuge from the cold. They're very cold sensitive. If temperature drops below 65, they need to find either shallow water or a warm water outfall from like a power plant or a spring. And they go to the Indian River Lagoon because it's fairly shallow and there's nothing to eat. And so they starve. They've been starving to death. And so all these dead, malnourished manatees turned up last year. And the state started, it's so dire that the state and the feds agreed to do what they called supplemental feeding, which they'd never done before. Oh my goodness. Where they actually took lettuce out there to the Indian River Lagoon and were putting in the water in a way that the manatees wouldn't associate it with people. Right. But they actually had, at one point they had, I think, more than 500 manatees gathered around eating this lettuce. Oh my goodness. It's like a soup kitchen for manatees. It's exactly what it is. And they're going to have to do it again next year and maybe the year after that, because they got to try and get the seagrass to come back.
So what's the source of this pollution?
It is fertilizer in stormwater runoff because people over their yards, farmers fertilize too much. Sewage plants that don't work and malfunction and leak. Septic tanks that have been in the ground too long and they're not working. So all of that stuff flows down every time there's rainfall. And most of Florida's environmental regulations on pollution are voluntary. Wow. And so, people are supposed to meet these goals, but if they don't, there's not really any penalty for it. And they're supposed to self-report any violations. Sure. So you can see where the problem is.
That works wonders. Yeah.
And so, because of all the toxic algae blooms, including a red tide bloom that went on for 19 months in 2017, 2018, Governor DeSantis said, actually, this became a political issue. People heckled Rick Scott at one of his public appearances, calling him Red Tide Rick. And so DeSantis said, I'm going to fix this. And so he appointed a task force called the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. Okay. Very smart scientists, no ringers in the bunch. They actually drew up a list of things that the state ought to do to fix the problem, and the legislature ignored them. And passed this bill they called the Clean Waterways Act, which I always contended ought to have quotation marks around the word clean. Right. It's very watered down. It was so bad that a lot of environmental groups said, Governor, please veto this so we can start over. And instead he signed it into law as if that would fix the problem. Well, it hasn't fixed the problem. Right. So we're spending a lot of money on manatee rescue and rehab and nothing on fixing the problem. Right. So that's where we are today.
Wow. Are there any suits that are pending?
The Save the Manatee Club, once again, is suing the EPA, saying that they failed to step in and make Florida do what it ought to do. And as a result, the manatee's habitat was messed up. So, and that they're therefore guilty of violating the Endangered Species Act. So we'll see how that works out. I should tell you, there's one sort of bright spot in all this. The lettuce that was provided for the manatees, the taxpayers didn't pay more than like $250 for that.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Because they got more than $150,000 in donations from around the world.
Wow.
People wanting to help out. People love manatees that much.
Yeah.
That they
it's
were
a
willing
symbol
to,
of the state.
Yeah, exactly. And several congressmen have called for manatees to be put back on the endangered list.
Right.
So far, the Fish and Wildlife Service has not done that. So,
and to explain for a lot of folks, it might seem like an oxymoron to want to put an animal back on the endangered list, but when you do put an animal back on the endangered list, it has extra protections that will save it. And if you take it off the endangered list too soon, it could decimate the population. And so that's why a lot of environmentalists want to keep animals on the endangered list longer than others might want.
Let's put it this way. The Fish and Wildlife Service hung up the mission accomplished banner way too early.
right. Did they do it on an aircraft carrier?
No.
Well, Florida is also famous for natural disasters, and I think they're number one in the country in, shark attacks and hurricanes, thunderstorms, and sinkholes, which a lot of people don't know about. Can you tell us what they are, how they happen?
Yeah, I mean, they are part of one of the glorious things about Florida, but they're also one of the scariest things about Florida. Florida has more freshwater springs than anywhere else on Earth. Freshwater, first magnitude springs, referring to how much water gushes out from below ground.
Okay.
In order for that to happen, you've got to be in this geological formation known as karst, which is it's limestone with all the holes that Swiss cheese would have in it. Right. And water flows through there willy-nilly, and sometimes it erodes the limestone to the point where it collapses. And when it does, then you have a sinkhole. And there's an area north of Tampa in Pasco County that's actually known as Sinkhole Alley, where they get so many sinkholes that it's, there are companies that actually specialize in coming in and trying to fill them with concrete whenever they happen. Wow. The Villages is one of the places where they have a lot of them. Okay. And one of the, I don't know if this has been proven, but one of the common theories is they're sucking so much water out of the ground to water the golf courses that it leaves the limestone with nothing to support it, and it falls in. And I had a friend who worked for the Village's official newspaper, which was owned by the developer. He said there were two things they were not allowed to mention. One, anything nice about Barack Obama, and two, sinkholes. They were not allowed to mention sinkholes in the paper. Okay. But I mean, they've actually had whole houses fall in, and it's amazing.
How big are these things?
They can be huge. There was one that happened in Polk County in a phosphate plant that was so gigantic people joked it was the new Disney ride, Journey to the Center of the Earth. and then they had another one 3 years ago in the same phosphate plant, just in like a mile and a half away from where that original one was back in the 90s, and it was also huge. And it happened in a one of the what they call gypsum stacks, where they pile up all the waste from processing phosphate. Which are the stacks are slightly radioactive, and they've got this pond of polluted water at the top that's slightly acidic. The sinkhole happened in the stack, and it sucked all 215 gallons of wastewater down into the aquifer.
Whoa!
So think of it as flavoring. So
right. Oh man,
yeah. So that's sort of the story of sinkholes, and they're supposed to disclose this stuff in real estate sales, but sometimes they don't. Right. And there was a very tragic incident in Hillsborough County where a guy was sleeping in his house, and a sinkhole happened under the house, and it just sucked him in, and nobody saw him.
Oh my God! Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God!
Yeah,
it was nightmares.
Incredibly tragic. On the flip side, there was a woman, I wrote about her in Florida, where she was in her backyard and actually fell into a sinkhole, and a neighbor kind of, heard her screaming and came and fished her out. A year later, she went back in her backyard and fell into a different sinkhole.
Oh my goodness.
But this time she had a cell phone with her, so she was able to call 911.
Well, that's good. Jeez,
yeah. Yeah. But it's like, lady, just stay out of the backyard for now.
Yeah. Stay out of the backyard or move. Yeah.
Well, imagine trying to sell your house after the sinkhole happens.
Right.
Who's going to buy that,
Right. Yeah, my goodness. And you think about filling it with concrete, wouldn't that just collapse the limestone even more? It
I'm not
doesn't.
sure what a long-term solution that would turn
Yeah,
out to be.
yeah.
When the one happened at the phosphate plant, they used a mixture that was sort of like grout to fill
Okay.
that sinkhole, and that's
Right. Okay.
because I guess it could expand as they put it in. So
Fair enough.
yeah.
So, favorite Florida man stories?
Oh,
What?
oh yeah,
Let,
oh yeah.
let's hear them.
Well, I mean, we don't, there's not an ultimate Florida man story. We haven't quite hit
Right.
that Mad Libs combination of nudity and alligator and meth that would push it over the top. But if we had a weird Florida Hall of Fame, there are some stories that would go in on the first ballot.
Okay. Let's hear them.
One of my favorites is one from the Keys. There was this guy there who his name was, I think, Carl Tansler. He called himself a count. He was more of a no account. And he was at one point working as an X-ray technician and fell in love with one of his patients, the beautiful Maria, and his love for her transcended death, by which I mean she died and he dug up the grave and lived with the body for 9 years until her sister found out and, of course, freaked out and reported him to the authorities, and he was arrested, but he was cleared. Can you guess why? He was charged with desecration of a grave. The statute of limitations had run out.
Oh my goodness! Years. I feel like that was that on This American Life?
Probably. It's just one of those amazing stories. And he ended up moving to Pasco County, and he created an effigy of her at his home. Yeah, it's bizarre. Another one is a guy who a classic good news bad news story. He had entered a contest run by a pet shop to win a python, and the way you won was to be the person who ate the most live cockroaches within a certain length of time. And so the good news is he won, and the bad news is he died.
Oh no!
And the medical examiner found that he had actually choked to death on insect parts, which I just wonder how often they check that box on the medical examiner's form.
Right.
One of my favorites involves a woman named Kathy Willits in Fort Lauderdale. She was entertaining guests at home for pay, if you know what I mean. And one of her customers got a little chummy with her, and her husband, who, unbeknownst to the customers, was inside a closet in the bedroom with a video camera and yellow legal pads taking notes, called him and left a message threatening him, saying, leave my wife alone. So the customer then turned around to the cops and reported it. The cops raided Mrs. Willits' house, and that's when they discovered that Mr. Willits was actually Deputy Willits. He was a police officer, and they seized the videotapes and all of the lists, and that subsequently led to a group of 9 men who all called themselves John Doe. So it was John Doe versus Broward County. They wanted to keep the list secret, the customer list. They wanted it withheld from public view, and so some very smart entrepreneurs in Broward County printed up T-shirts that said, "I'm not on the list," and I think sold out within like an hour. This case went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, which ruled that if you're doing something naughty, you have no expectation of privacy.
I see.
So they released the customer list, and as you might guess, it had some politicians' names on it.
Sure,
who had been trying to shut down smutty book places, and the moral majority type people.
Right.
There were lots of twists and turns in the story. My favorite one was that at one point they claimed that this was marriage therapy, that she was a nymphomaniac, and anyway, ultimately, if it was indeed marriage therapy, it worked because they are still together 20 years later.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Right. Well, good for them.
Yeah.
Never floats their boat, I guess.
Exactly.
God bless
this is what
them.
passes for normal in Florida.
Well, one area of the state we didn't mention, and that was I drove right by it just last week, was Lake Okeechobee, and
Oh,
it
yeah.
reminded me, I was expecting fishing docks and people kind of casting out the rods, but it reminded me more of Louisiana, where they have a levee, and so the
Hmm.
stretch that I was on, you could barely see the lake at times. I
Right.
mean, it is a gigantic lake.
It's the
Are there
second
areas?
largest lake in the United States.
Is it really?
Yeah,
Okay.
and it's one of the best bass fishing places in the
Okay.
country as well. But it is probably the biggest, if not, it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, pollution problems in the state.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
because for years the sugar companies would dump they'd back pump the
Right.
fertilizer and pesticides and everything off of their property into the lake. And meanwhile,
Right.
all the little cities along the edge of the dike, the southern edge, they're using it as their water source.
Right.
So it's just it's a big mess. And the dike is so old; it's actually named for Herbert Hoover. That's how long it's been there, and it's
Okay.
got lots of cracks and seepages. And
Okay.
it's run by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which they manage the lake. And if the lake starts getting too high because of rainfall and it's hurricane season, then they
Okay.
start releasing the water out of the lake to
Right.
the east. It goes to the St. Lucie area, and
Okay.
to the west, it goes through the Caloosahatchee River and winds up around Sanibel.
Okay.
And the water in the lake often carries blue-green algae in it if it's
Okay.
summertime. So
Right.
the algae bloom then gets transferred to those other areas, and the pollution in the water is bad anyway. And
Right.
so it turns the water an ugly color around Sanibel, and they've had a
Yeah.
number of algae bloom problems in the St. Lucie area, to the point where at one point they actually had to close the beaches for July 4th, not
Oh,
because
no.
not because of sharks, but because they
Right.
had guacamole looking algae
Oh,
blooming out there
jeez.
that just smelled.
Yeah.
One woman out there told me it smelled like death on a cracker. It was just
There you go.
so foul. And so there's been this huge push to eliminate those releases, because the way the lake used to work, it was part of the Everglades system. The Kissimmee River would flow
Right.
into the
So
lake. When the lake got too full, the water would spill over the edge and flow downward into the
the
Everglades. That
Everett.
was
Right.
literally where the river of grass came from.
Right.
It was this very slow moving 2 mile wide or 20-mile wide swath that would flow
Right.
southward into the Keys, into the Florida Bay.
Yeah.
And they built this dike because in 1928 there was a hurricane that basically took the water out of the lake and dumped it into the area where people live, where a lot of poor
Yeah.
black people lived, and killed
Right.
thousands of them. This is the hurricane Zora Neale Hurston wrote about in Their Eyes Were Watching God, in her famous novel.
Wow. Okay.
And I think she called the lake the Monstropolis Beast,
I
which
like
is
that term.
it's a horrifying scene in the book. I mean,
Yeah.
I recommend the book, but don't read it during hurricane season.
My goodness.
And so they built this dike that now keeps the water from getting into the Everglades. And so now there's
Gotcha.
this big
Okay.
discussion: do we release the water southward, or do we find some other way to release it more slowly to the east and west, or do we build a reservoir on sugar
Right.
property? And the sugar people say, no, you can't build on our. It was just a huge mess. And meanwhile, there's
Right.
there's like a 3-foot section at the bottom of the lake that's just it's muck. It's
Right.
all the pollution and pesticides and everything all kind of
Right.
there. And whenever there's a lot of turbulence in the lake, it becomes like a chocolate mess
Oh,
in there.
jeez.
And so, but if you're going to take it out, the only way to do it is to like section off parts of the lake, dredge it out, take the muck out, and then start another section, which is incredibly long, slow, and expensive to do. So,
Yeah, particularly at a lake that big. It
so
seems.
how do you fix this? So they're
Yeah.
they're working on different ideas, and of course there's a lot of greed involved. So,
Fair
but
enough.
but
As it goes.
for the most part, Florida has chosen to benefit the sugar companies over the coastal economies that depend on clean water and clean beaches.
Really? That's
Yeah.
surprising.
Yeah, well, that's how big a stick the sugar companies
Right.
swing in
Wow.
Florida.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned Sanibel, and I wanted to get back to that. And I'd been on Sanibel, and you see this big barge off a mile off the coast in this giant pipe. The sand renourishment. Can you
Oh
talk a
yeah.
little bit about that and tell
Yes.
people what
Yeah.
that's all about?
That's the beach version of plastic surgery.
Okay.
Whenever there's tidal action on the barrier islands. That's the barrier islands move back and forth. They don't stay in one place. But if you build something on the barrier island, you don't want that to move around. You want you don't want to suddenly
Right.
lose the beach in front of your your
Right.
waterfront condo or your hotel. So the
Yeah.
Army Corps of Engineers comes in and pumps new sand out there on the beach to rebuild the beach, and they call that renourishment because that sounds better
Right.
than we're wasting your tax dollars putting
Yeah.
sand out there that's just going to wash away again in 10 years,
Right.
because that's
Right.
what happens.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's the whole idea of like injecting fillers in your lips to pump them up, but it goes away after
Yeah.
a while. So
Yep.
but it's Florida gets more, and it's taxpayers all over the country that pay for this. Florida
Right.
gets more beach renourishment projects than anywhere else because we got more
Wow.
beaches. So
Right. And more hurricanes.
yeah, but we hate the federal government. We're darn you, Biden administration. But
Right.
but also, can you help us pay for fixing
Right.
our beach that we screwed up?
Right.
So
Right. Right. Well, I wanted to finish up on some of the more weirder stories, and you had touched a couple pages in your book on UFOs. Can
Oh
you talk
yes.
a little bit about
Oh
that?
yeah. We get a lot of UFO sightings in Florida. One of my friends, in fact, jokes that Roswell was actually just a distraction while the aliens actually infiltrated Florida.
Right.
One of the biggest UFO sighting cases in history happened up in the Panhandle. Happened near my hometown of Pensacola. Happened in the place
Okay.
called Gulf Breeze,
Okay.
where even the mayor claimed to have actually witnessed a UFO hovering over the town. And the guy who took the first pictures of it and helped promote it and so forth, he later sold his house to somebody else who said, I went up in the attic and found 2 styrofoam plates glued together, and it looked like the pictures of the UFO.
Oh God. No.
It was all a hoax. But even before that, back in the 60s, there was a guy who lived in the Brooksville area north of Tampa,
Okay.
who was he was the first person to report being abducted by a UFO, and he claimed that the aliens had taken him up in their spaceship several times and had tried to
Okay.
communicate with him. Don't know if they got into the whole anal probe thing. I don't know.
Right. Right.
But I think this was
Right.
before that. But he claimed that
Right.
they had given him maps to different, like the dark side of the moon, and
Sure.
had given him a coded cure for cancer, which he couldn't share
Right.
with anyone.
Of course not.
And
Yes.
of course, a lot of people didn't believe him. He actually built a replica of the UFO at the front of his property, complete with flashing lights, which
Okay.
people kept driving by and driving off the road because they didn't know what
Oh,
the
God.
hell.
Right. Right. And I'm
But
sure his neighbors loved him.
yeah, but he was actually known as the Dean of UFO abductees because he was the first one.
Okay. All right. Well, got to be a first.
Yes, exactly.
Are you familiar with the Jackie Gleason Richard Nixon story?
Well, I know Nixon lived in Key Biscayne and was buddies with B.B. Rebozo. And also the Watergate burglary was actually planned at Key Biscayne.
Oh,
And
wow.
and
Okay.
the burglars were Miami guys who are veterans
Wow.
of the Bay of Pigs. But I'm not sure about the Jackie Gleason part of that.
Well, this Jackie Gleason was a very well-known UFO aficionado, and in fact, his house is not too far from me. It's in the shape of a UFO, and it's a
Oh.
beautifully constructed, wood-constructed house, and it just recently went on the market, and
Mhm.
that's why I looked up the story and his fascination with UFOs. The story was told by his ex-wife. And of course, was one of the more renowned papers in the world, based in Florida, the National Enquirer.
Oh, yes.
So,
Yes.
we'll take it with as many grains of salt as you wish.
Well,
but
they are the ones that told us about Elvis being alive again and about
Right, right.
Bat Boy being found in a
Right.
Kentucky cave.
So as she tells the story, and I guess this was some years later, and she was, I guess, writing a book about Jackie. There was a charity golf tournament in somewhere in South Florida, and Richard Nixon took a part, and him and Jackie Gleason were very good friends.
Mhm.
And apparently they were hanging out after the golf tournament, drinking, and Jackie, told Nixon about his fascination with the UFOs, and Nixon said, well, hey, come along, I got something to show you. And they drove to Homestead Air Force Base.
Yeah.
And apparently Nixon was known for kind of ditching his Secret Service and doing this, just driving on his own. So they drove, of course, to the proverbial, back far reaches of the Air Force Base and walked into some classified hangar, and there in what was described as 6 or 8 Coke ice boxes were apparently alien bodies suspended in some sort of formaldehyde. So again, I don't know how true that story.
Yeah, I wonder how much salt was there around those bodies, because you need to take a lot of it with that story.
Oh man. The one truth to that story is that it was on Nixon's calendar that they did in fact play golf together on the date that.
Well, that proves it's all true then. There's one other Watergate connection, is that when Nixon made his famous "I am not a crook" speech, it was at Disney World. So that was one more fantasy, I guess.
Well, that whole thing came full circle, I guess.
Yes,
to Florida. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Craig, this has been really great. And how can people find out more about you, get your books, tell us about your podcast, all that?
Sure. So I've written 6 books about what I call the most interesting state, because I think that's more accurate than the Sunshine State, because we actually get some of our cities get more
quite a bit of rain.
We get more rainfall than Seattle in some of our cities.
Wow.
But the one that's the big bestseller is "Oh, Florida: How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country."
Great book.
Thank you. That got rejected by 15 publishers.
Really?
Yes. And then St. Martin said, "We think this is a really good idea," and it actually made the New York Times bestseller list and got rave reviews. And anyway, then Cattail: The Wild Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther, which came out in 2020, and then the most recent book is "The State You're In: Florida Men, Florida Women, and Other Wildlife," which is. It's not a sequel to "Oh, Florida." It's more like "Son of Oh, Florida." Okay. It's a collection of 50 or so stories and columns I've written over the last 30 years about mermaids and nudists battling the Postal Service over their packages, and the most tattooed woman alive and her love story, and the usual suspects. The podcast is called "Welcome to Florida." My co-host is Chad Scott. Okay. And our conceit is, of the 900 new people moving to Florida every day, we're trying to tell them what you've gotten yourselves into. So we've done interviews with a gator wrangler, a python hunter, the head of the Nudist Recreation Society in Florida, who assured us he was wearing clothes while we were talking to him. The guy who literally wrote the book on the villages. Someone who's an expert on the Sunshine Law, hurricane experts. We're having fun, and occasionally we have sponsors. So that's
great, and it's good to hear.
And we put out a new edition every week. And then if you're interested in ordering my books, the best place to order them from is Tombolo Books, TOMBOLO, which is a bookstore about 10 minutes from where I live, and I go by there and autograph their copies as often as I can. So and they do a pretty good business of selling the autographed copies. So, and
that's Tombolo Books in St. Petersburg.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right.
And I've got a weekly newsletter, author newsletter that I put out. People want to send me their email address via my website, which is craigpittman.com. I had to have one that was easy to remember. The newsletter is called "Oh, Florida, the Newsletter." I thought long and hard about that name. And every week I count down the top 5 "Oh, Florida" stories of the week.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So like a couple of weeks ago, it was a professional mermaid who was suing a former mermaid turned witch and her husband, who's a nosy cop, for invasion of privacy.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Lots of good stories there. And the hard part is narrowing it to just 5.
Narrowing it down, not finding them, just narrowing it down.
Yes.
Right. It's just the curation.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Craig, that was very fast. 90 minutes. It flew by, and there's a lot of material. I guess.
Oh,
the state of Florida.
We have just scratched the surface here, man. We haven't even talked about Casadega, the most psychic place in the most psychic town in the world. That's in Florida too. And
All right.
And we've got more nudist resorts than anywhere else. In fact, during the last hurricane, one of my jobs was to call around and see which hotels would take hurricane evacuees.
Okay.
So I called one of the nudist resorts, and they said, yes, we will. A place called Caliente.
Right.
And they said, yes,
Okay.
we will accept hurricane evacuees. And the good news is you don't have to pack your clothes.
Right. If
So
you've run out of socks and underwear, that's the place to go.
That's the place to go, exactly. So anyway, yes, there's lots more to talk about, but
right.
we've hit the time limit. So
all right. Well, thank you, Craig. That's
Sure.
been great. And everybody check out craigpittman.com and buy some books. And Florida is available all over, even in my local library here in Connecticut. So it's
awesome.
Recent national audiences, and Florida seems to be the place to be. So come down and join the folks in the
party.
Join the party
And bring your money.
Bring your money.